The door didn't just close, it slammed, and Margaret Hollis, the boarding house owner, did it while looking Eliza Rowan directly in the eye, slow enough to make sure the message landed. "We don't take in women like you," Margaret said. Her voice carried across the porch and down the street, sharp and deliberate, loud enough that three men standing near the grain store turned to look. "A widow with debts and a sickly child is not what this establishment needs. Take your bag and your boy and find somewhere else to be a burden." Owen pressed himself against his mother's side. He was 7 years old and had already learned what it meant when grown women spoke like that. Eliza didn't move. Not yet. If you've ever been turned away from the only door still open to you, if you've ever stood on a porch with nothing left and felt the whole street watching, then you already know what the next few seconds felt like for her. Or what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that porch, because what happened next changed everything. The stagecoach had already gone. Eliza heard it before she saw it was too late, the rumble and clatter of wheels on hard-packed road, fading east toward the next town. She had watched it go from the window of the coach itself 20 minutes ago when the driver called out Forsyth Creek, and she had gathered Owen's hand in their single trunk and stepped down into the pale afternoon light. She had a name written on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. Margaret Hollis. Forsyth Creek Boarding House. Respectable, clean, reasonable rates. A woman in the last town had written it down with confidence, said Margaret. Hollis ran a decent place and didn't ask too many questions as long as you paid on time. Eliza had paid on time her entire life. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the letter that had arrived 3 weeks before Thomas died. The one from the bank in Caldwell that she had folded and refolded until the creases were almost holes. The one that listed what Thomas Rowan had borrowed against what Thomas Rowan had never managed to repay. She hadn't known about those debts when he was alive. She had learned about them the way most women learned about the worst parts of their husbands, at the funeral, from a stranger in a suit. She was not a woman who had done anything wrong, but try explaining that to a town that had already heard otherwise. Forsyth Creek was small enough that news moved the way weather moved, fast and without asking permission. Eliza had been in town less than an hour, had spoken to fewer than 4 people, and already something had shifted in the air around her. She felt it the way you feel a change in temperature. Not dramatic, just real. She had found the boarding house on the main street, 2 blocks from where the stagecoach had stopped. The building was neat, painted white with green shutters, a hand-lettered sign over the door. She had knocked politely, introduced herself clearly, stated her business. She had the money for 2 weeks in advance folded in the pocket of her coat, alongside the paper with Margaret Hollis's name on it. Margaret had smiled at first, the professional kind, the one that doesn't quite reach the eyes. She had glanced at Owen, who stood quietly beside his mother with his cap in both hands, and then something in her expression had changed. Not all at once. Gradual. The way a door swings shut on a hinge that's starting to rust. "Rowan," Margaret had said, repeating the name slowly. "From Caldwell?" "Previously," Eliza said. The woman had excused herself for a moment, gone into the back room. Eliza had waited in the entryway with Owen, looking at the wallpaper, yellow roses on cream, and listening to the muffled sound of voices she couldn't quite make out. When Margaret came back, the professional smile was gone. "I'm afraid the room's been taken," she said. Eliza looked at her steadily. "You told me this morning, when I sent the telegram ahead, that you had a room available through the end of the month. Circumstances change." "What circumstances?" The pause lasted exactly long enough to confirm what Eliza already suspected. Then Margaret said, not quietly, not with any particular shame, "We don't take in women like you." And then she closed the door. Owen made a small sound beside her. Not a cry, just a breath caught wrong. Eliza put her hand on the back of his head without looking down at him. She kept her eyes on the door for a moment. The painted wood, the brass knocker shaped like a fish, the gap at the bottom where a cold draft came through. Then she picked up her bag. She was not going to stand on that porch and feel humiliated in front of her son. She walked them both to the edge of the porch and sat Owen down on the trunk while she tried to think. The street in front of them was quiet. An older man crossed without looking their way. A woman hanging laundry on the side of the building next door glanced over once and then became very interested in her sheets. Owen said, "Where are we going now, Mama?" And Eliza said, "I'm figuring that out." She said it calmly. That was the part that cost her the most. The calm. Because the truth was she had $43 and some cents to her name. The trunk held 2 changes of clothing for each of them, a pair of Owen's boots that were already half a size too small, a photograph of her mother, and a small jar of dried herbs she'd brought from the kitchen in Caldwell out of habit rather than practicality. She had no family within 300 miles. She had no friends in this town. She had a name on a piece of paper, and the piece of paper had turned out to be worth nothing. She had come to Forsyth Creek because there was supposed to be work here. Not grand work, simple work. Cooking, keeping house, whatever honest labor looked like. She was good at it. She had been running a household since she was 14 years old, had put 3 meals a day on a table through drought years and lean years, and the year Thomas couldn't get out of bed for 3 months, and she hadn't told anyone why. She knew how to manage on very little. She'd had a lot of practice. But she had no room, and the afternoon was getting older, and Owen was sitting on the trunk with his hands folded in his lap, doing the thing he did when he was scared, going very still and very quiet, as if making himself smaller might somehow help. It didn't help, she knew that, but she understood the instinct. She was still standing at the edge of the porch, working through what options remained to her, when she became aware of someone watching her from the direction of the hardware store across the street. Not the rude sideways watching she'd felt since arriving. Something different, direct, patient. A man stood beside a post horse, not leaning on it, just standing. He wore a canvas work coat that had been mended at one elbow, boots with real trail mud on them, and a hat pulled down enough that she couldn't read his expression from this distance. He wasn't moving. He wasn't pretending he hadn't been watching either. Eliza met his eyes across the street. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Owen on the trunk, then back at her. Then he crossed the street. He wasn't quick about it. He didn't rush over the way some men did when they smelled trouble and thought it meant opportunity. He just walked at a steady, unhurried pace, the way a man walks when he's already decided something and isn't second-guessing himself. He stopped at a respectful distance, took his hat off. "Name's Silas Mercer," he said. "I've got a ranch about 4 miles out. My cook left 2 weeks ago, and I've got 8 hands and nobody to feed them properly." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. I need the work done. Can you keep a kitchen?" Eliza looked at him. She was 31 years old. She had buried a husband, walked away from a house that was no longer hers, ridden a stagecoach for 2 days with a 7-year-old who hadn't complained once, even when he should have. She had just been turned away from the only address she had in this town, in front of her child, loud enough for 3 strangers to hear. She was tired in a way that had very little to do with sleep. "Yes," she said, "I can keep a kitchen." "The boy comes too," Silas said. It wasn't a question. "He does." "That's fine." He put his hat back on. "I've got a wagon around back. We can leave when you're ready." She almost said, "What do you want in return?" because she had learned, in the way that experience teaches things, not books, that most offers had terms that came out later. But something in the way he stood, the way he had said, "I need the work done" instead of "I'm doing you a favor," made her hold the question. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She went back to Owen and crouched down to his level. His eyes were searching her face for what to feel. "We have a place to go," she said. "A ranch. A man named Mr. Mercer needs a cook, and he says you can come." Owen thought about it. "Is it far?" 4 miles. "Are there horses?" "Probably." He nodded once, the way he did when he was agreeing to be brave about something. "Okay." She helped him off the trunk, gathered their things, and walked around the side of the boarding house to where Silas Mercer waited with a wagon that had seen real use. There were sacks of grain in the back, a coil of rope, a wooden crate with a broken slat that had been tied shut with twine. It was not a fancy wagon. Owen climbed up without being asked and sat carefully on the bench. Silas loaded the trunk without comment and then went around to the driver's side. They left Forsyth Creek without speaking. The town watched them go the same way it had watched her arrive, with the particular attention of people who have already decided what story they're telling themselves about you. Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked straight ahead at the road. She did not let herself feel relieved yet. Relief was something you earned. She had not earned it. She had simply moved from one uncertainty to another, and the only real difference was that this uncertainty had a destination. The road out of town was rutted and dry, and the wagon moved without comfort. Owen eventually leaned against her arm, not saying anything, just making contact the way children did when they were holding on without making a scene of it. She felt the small, warm weight of him and kept her eyes on the horizon. Silas drove without conversation. That suited her. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. After about a mile, he said, "Margaret Hollis has been running that place for 12 years. She's turned away people before for less reason than she had with you. I wouldn't take it as a measure of your worth." Eliza glanced at him. "You know her well." "Well enough." He didn't elaborate. "Then you know what she said." "I heard some of it." Eliza looked back at the road. "Then you also know what people in that town are already saying about me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Word moves fast here. It always has. That's not something I can change." Another pause. "But what happens on my land is my business." She didn't respond. Not because she disagreed, but because she had learned to wait and see whether men meant the things they said. Some did. Most didn't. Not because they were dishonest, exactly, but because they said things in the moment of meaning them and then forgot by the following week when it became inconvenient. She would wait. The ranch appeared after a long curve in the road, a main house, a bunkhouse, a barn, 3 outbuildings, all of it showing the particular kind of wear that comes not from poverty, but from a man doing too many things at once for too long by himself. Fences that needed repainting. A gate leaning slightly. Wood stacked, but not quite straight. A dog came out from under the porch and barked once at the wagon, then seemed to decide it wasn't worth the energy and went back under. Owen watched the dog with visible interest. Silas pulled the wagon up near the main house and climbed down. He looked at Eliza. "Kitchen's inside. I'll warn you. It's not in good shape. My cook before last did more damage on the way out than she did good while she was here, and the one after that didn't stay long enough to fix anything." "How many hands are you feeding?" 8, sometimes 9 if my neighbor's boy is helping out." 3 meals? "Breakfast before dawn, noon if they're near enough to come in, supper at 6. She nodded, running the math already. "What do you have in the pantry?" "Come see for yourself." She climbed down from the wagon, and Owen climbed down after her, and the 3 of them walked into the house that was not yet any of their homes, but would, before long, become something none of them had expected. The kitchen was, as Silas had warned, not in good shape. One hinge on the cabinet was broken clean off, so the door hung at an angle and couldn't close properly. The iron stove had rust along the left side near the firebox. Not deep rust, but the kind that told you it had been sitting cold and neglected for longer than was good for it. 2 of the shelves had been pulled from the wall. Not fallen, pulled, with the screws still embedded in chunks of plaster on the floor. The work counter had a crack running diagonally across it, old enough that someone had stuffed the gap with a rag that had since turned gray. Eliza walked through it without flinching. She opened the pantry and looked at what was there. A sack of flour, maybe 8 pounds. Dried beans, 2 varieties. Cornmeal, salt, lard, half a tin, a string of dried onions, a jar of something she couldn't immediately identify. Oats. Some dried peppers. She could make 3 meals from this. Not comfortable meals. Not meals anyone would brag about. But meals. Owen stood in the doorway watching his mother move through the kitchen with the focused quiet of someone assessing a situation, not reacting to it. Silas stood behind him. He hadn't said a word since they came inside. Eliza came out of the pantry and looked at the stove. "Do you have a poker and a wire brush?" she said. "Should be in the toolbox by the back door. And a piece of lumber I can use to prop that cabinet door until the hinge is fixed?" "A beat. I can fix the hinge." "Good. I'll need it done before I can use those shelves properly." She looked at him. "The counter crack, how old is it?" 1.5 years, maybe 2. "Has water gotten into it?" "Some." "I'll need to repack it properly. A rag isn't enough." She looked around the room one more time. "I can have something on the table for supper tonight. It won't be much, but it'll be hot, and it'll be enough." Silas studied her for a moment. "All right. The boy needs somewhere to sleep." "There's a room off the back of the house, small. Used to be a storage room. I cleared it out last year. It's got a cot." "1 cot. I'll bring another in from the bunkhouse." Eliza nodded. She was already moving toward the toolbox. Behind her, she heard Owen say quietly to Silas, "Are there really horses?" And Silas said, "7 of them." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, "Could I see them sometime? I won't bother them." Silas looked down at him. "Tomorrow morning, if your mother says it's all right. I'll introduce you proper." And in the kitchen, Eliza opened the toolbox, found the wire brush, and began to work. She didn't let herself think about Margaret Hollis or the boarding house or the stagecoach that had already gone east. She didn't let herself think about Thomas's debts or the bank letter or the 3 strangers who had turned to watch her be humiliated on a public porch. She thought about the rust on the firebox and how long it would take to clear. She thought about whether the oats were old enough to need soaking before morning. She thought about the crack in the counter and what would hold it better than a rag. She thought about the work, because the work was the only thing right now that she could actually affect. Outside, the sun was getting lower. In less than 2 hours, 8 men were going to come in from wherever they'd been and expect to find food on a table. She had 2 hours. She pulled the stove away from the wall just far enough to check the flue, found it partly blocked with old ash and a bird's nest that had been there long enough to become structural, and started clearing it with the poker. The first sparks of the fire she built were small and uncertain. By the time Owen appeared in the doorway to tell her that Mr. Mercer had fixed the cabinet hinge, the fire was steady. And by the time the hands came in from the fields, there was cornbread on the table, beans cooked down with the dried peppers and onions until they had actual flavor, and a pot of coffee that Eliza had found hidden behind the flour sack. Enough grounds left for one strong pot, which she stretched with hot water into something that at least smelled like the real thing. Nobody praised the meal, but every plate came back empty. And one man, older than the rest, with a gray beard and the kind of eyes that had stopped being surprised by things years ago, caught Eliza's eye as he put his plate down and gave her a single, small nod. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And after the day she'd had, honest was worth more than almost anything. That night, after Owen was asleep on his cot and the house had gone quiet, Eliza sat at the kitchen table with a cup of the last of the stretched coffee and looked at the cabinet door that now hung straight and closed properly. She was not safe here. She knew that. Gossip didn't stop at fence lines. The things people in town were already saying about her: widow, debts, a woman with no prospects taking up in a bachelor rancher's house. Those things would grow before they shrank, and she knew it. But tonight there was a roof above her son's head, and food in his stomach, and a fire still warm in the iron stove. Tomorrow would be what it would be. She finished the coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to bed. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. The second morning came the way most hard mornings did, without warning and without mercy. Eliza was already at the stove before the sky had fully decided what color it wanted to be. She had learned, in the years of managing a household that ran on Thomas's unpredictable schedule, that the only reliable way to stay ahead of a day was to start before it did. So she was up at 4:30, fire going by 4:40, and the first batch of biscuit dough worked by 5, all before a single ranch hand had stirred in the bunkhouse across the yard. The kitchen was marginally better than it had been the night before. Silas had fixed the cabinet hinge before supper. The crack in the counter she had repacked herself with a strip of oilcloth she'd found folded behind the flour tin. Not a proper fix, but better than the rag. The stove drew clean now that the flue was clear, and she had discovered, behind a loose board in the pantry, 3 jars of preserved tomatoes that the previous cook had apparently hidden and forgotten. She had brought them out and lined them on the newly straight shelf like small victories. Owen slept through her movements, which was both a relief and a small ache. He was a light sleeper at home, had been since he was an infant, but the past weeks of travel had worn him down to something deeper than his usual rest. She let him sleep. There was nothing yet for him to wake up to, and sleep was still the one thing she could give him for free. The hands came in at 6, 8 of them, the same faces from the night before, though in the morning light she could read them more clearly. There was the older one with the gray beard who had given her that nod. His name turned out to be Holt, and he sat at the same end of the table 2 mornings in a row, which told her something about him. There was a young one, couldn't have been more than 19, who ate fast and kept his eyes down and was clearly homesick in the way that boys that age got homesick. Not crying about it, just carrying it around like a stone in his pocket. His name was Cody. There were 2 brothers who finished each other's sentences and argued about everything else. There was a man named Darnell who said almost nothing but had the kind of attentiveness that meant he noticed more than he let on. Silas came in last. That was his pattern. She would come to learn. He never sat until everyone else had been served. The biscuits were better than the cornbread had been. She'd had proper ingredients to work with this time, and enough sleep to remember the proportions correctly. There were scrambled eggs. She had found 12 eggs in a crate in the barn and used 10 of them, and sliced salt pork fried crisp, and the coffee this morning was actual coffee, not stretched. Nobody said anything exceptional, but the table was louder than it had been the night before, and that was its own kind of measurement. Holt, at the end of the table, said, "You from Caldwell?" Eliza, carrying the coffee pot, looked at him directly. Previously, he nodded, the same way he'd nodded the night before. Deliberate. Unbothered. Good farming country out there. It was. He didn't push further. She appreciated that. Silas watched the exchange from his end of the table without contributing to it. When the meal was over and the men filed out, he stayed behind with his coffee cup and waited until the door had closed. "Holt's been with me 11 years, he said. He doesn't say anything he doesn't mean. I noticed. If he's asking where you're from, it's not gossip. He's just placing you." Eliza started stacking plates. "I didn't assume it was gossip. A man that age with eyes like that is usually just trying to understand where things fit." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're good at reading people." "I've had reasons to be." He didn't respond to that. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the table rather than the counter, and went out. She noticed that the cup on the table, not out of carelessness, she thought, out of not wanting to add to her workload without thinking about it first. Whether that was intentional or just habitual, she didn't know yet. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30, still in his sleeping clothes, hair flattened on one side, blinking at the light through the window. "Did I miss breakfast?" he said. "I kept a plate." He sat at the table and ate without complaint, which was typical for him. He was not a demanding child. Eliza had noticed early that this was not entirely a virtue. It was partly a child who had learned somewhere along the way that asking for things often made the people around him more stressed rather than less. She was working on convincing him that asking was allowed. It was slow work. "Mr. Mercer said I could see the horses this morning," Owen said, between bites. "He did. Is it still all right? After you've dressed and cleared your plate?" He ate faster. Silas took Owen to the barn while Eliza cleaned up the kitchen. She could see them through the window above the sink, the tall man and the small boy walking across the yard, Owen's head tilted up to say something, Silas's head tilting slightly down to hear it. She didn't let herself read too much into it. It was a man showing a child some horses, nothing more than common decency. But she watched until they went through the barn door. Then she turned back to the dishes. The first real trouble came from town, as she had known it would, on the fourth day. She had walked to Forsyth Creek that morning to buy supplies. Silas had given her a list and a reasonable amount of money and the use of the light wagon, which she drove herself without asking whether she was expected to. She tied the horse at the post outside the general store and went in with the list in her hand. The store owner was a man named Cartwright, late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the particular manner of a man who ran the only general store in a small town and knew it. He watched her come in with the kind of attention that was professionally neutral and personally calculating. She gave him the list. He looked at it. "Mercer's account?" he said. "Yes." He nodded, began moving through the store pulling items. She followed, noting what he was choosing, checking it mentally against what she knew was needed. He gave her the second-quality salt pork when the better cut was right there. She noticed. She didn't say anything yet. She wanted to see if it was habit or intention. When he reached the flour, he hesitated. "You're the widow from Caldwell," he said. "Not a question." "Eliza Rowan," she said. I'm the cook at the Mercer Ranch." He pulled the flour. "Thomas Rowan's wife." "His widow." He set the flour on the counter and looked at her over the reading glasses. "Those debts of his, Caldwell Bank reached out to our branch last month, looking to see if he had any assets that transferred." Eliza felt the familiar tightening in her chest that she had learned to speak through rather than let silence her. "My husband's debts were his debts. I was not a signatory on the loans." "No," Cartwright said. But a widow traveling with debts attached to her name tends to make merchants cautious. There are no debts attached to my name, she said, specifically and legally. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached past the second-quality salt pork and pulled the better cut and added it to the pile without comment. It was a small concession, and she suspected it cost him something, and she filed it away as information about the kind of man he was. Not entirely unkind, but not willing to lead with fairness either. She paid from Silas's account, loaded the wagon, and drove back. She didn't tell Silas about the conversation. Not because she was hiding it, but because it would have required explaining things she wasn't ready to explain and asking for a defense she didn't want to need yet. That evening, after supper, she heard two of the hands talking on the porch. She wasn't trying to listen. She was carrying scraps out to the bin behind the house. But sound carried clearly in the dry evening air, and she caught enough. Here she's got debts chasing her from Caldwell. Mercer knows what he's getting into. Man's been alone too long, if you ask me, not thinking straight. She went back inside and did not throw the scrap bucket, which she considered briefly and then decided against. Silas found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, reorganizing the pantry in a way that did not strictly need reorganizing at that moment. He looked at her for a second. Something wrong with the pantry. The oats were in the wrong place. He leaned against the door frame. He was quiet in the way that some men were quiet, not empty, but waiting. I heard your hands talking on the porch, she said, not looking up from the shelf. About me. What'd they say? What people in this town are saying. He was quiet again. Then, you want me to address it with them? She turned and looked at him. Would it stop them saying it? Probably not. Then don't. It'll make it worse. Men don't stop talking because they're told to. They just talk somewhere you can't hear them. He considered that. That's a fairly dim view of men. It's an accurate view of people, she said. Women do it too. They're just quieter about where they do it. He almost smiled. Almost. What do you want me to do then? Nothing. She turned back to the shelf. I want you to let me handle my own reputation and focus on running your ranch. All right. He straightened from the doorframe. For what it's worth, I don't put stock in what Cartwright tells people at the grain counter. She looked at him. You heard about that already. Small town. Apparently. She moved the cornmeal to the left. He gave me the better cut of salt pork in the end. He usually does if you wait him out. Good to know. Silas left her alone in the pantry. She stood there for a moment after his footsteps faded, looking at the shelves, which were now organized in a way that made more practical sense than they had before, regardless of whether that had been the point when she started. The second week brought harder cold and a leak in the roof above the back room where she and Owen slept. She woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of water hitting the floor with a steady, flat patience that suggested it had been going for a while. Owen slept through it somehow. She moved their cots away from the drip, put a pot underneath it, and lay back down, listening to the irregular ping of water in metal until the sky started to go gray. In the morning, she told Silas about the leak. He went up on the roof that afternoon with tar paper and a bucket of pitch. It took him 3 hours. She could hear him moving around above the kitchen, the occasional scrape of tools, once a sharp curse that floated down through the thin ceiling, followed by silence as if he'd caught himself, and then a second, quieter version of the same word. Owen found this extremely funny. He pressed his hand over his mouth and looked at Eliza with wide eyes. We don't repeat what we hear from a roof, she said. He nodded seriously. Then his shoulders shook. She turned away before he could see that she was trying not to laugh herself. When Silas came down, there was pitch on his left hand and a streak of something dark across his jaw. And he looked genuinely irritated in the way of a man who had done a thing that took longer than expected and still wasn't entirely sure he'd done it right. It'll hold through the week, he said. I'll get a proper roofer in from Harlan before the real winter comes. Thank you, Eliza said. He looked at her. She had said it plainly, not effusively, and he seemed to understand the difference. He nodded and went to wash his hands. Owen watched him go and then said, in a voice just above a whisper, he fixed it. He did. Do people usually fix things when you tell them they're broken? Eliza considered how to answer that. Sometimes, she said finally, the right people do. Owen thought about this for a while. He did that. took information and went somewhere with it internally before he came back. Is Mr. Mercer one of the right people? She looked at the ceiling, which no longer dripped. Too soon to tell, she said, but that's a point in his column. What she hadn't said, what she wouldn't say to a 7-year-old who was already trying to calibrate the world into safe and unsafe, was that she was watching Silas Mercer with a careful and guarded attention. Not suspicion, exactly. More like the way you test ice before you walk on it. Not because you assume it'll break, but because the cost of being wrong is too high to skip the test. He had not done anything that alarmed her. He kept a professional distance that was, if anything, more careful than necessary. He spoke to Owen with a directness that was neither false warmth nor impatience. He had fixed the hinge, the roof, and she had noticed 2 mornings ago that the chair she sat in at the table, which had wobbled since the first day, had stopped wobbling without her having mentioned it. He hadn't said anything about fixing the chair. He'd just fixed it. That was either very thoughtful or worth watching more carefully. She hadn't decided which. The gossip came to her directly for the first time on a Saturday, 11 days in. She had gone to the dry goods section at the edge of the general store to buy thread. Her own money, her own errand, nothing to do with the ranch supplies. 2 women were already there. She recognized one of them from the street the day she arrived. The woman with the sheets who had found them very interesting. The other was younger, well-dressed in the particular way of someone whose husband had money, and who therefore felt that her opinions carried additional weight. They stopped talking when Eliza walked up, which meant they had been talking about something they didn't want her to hear, which meant they had been talking about her. Eliza took the thread she needed from the rack and turned to go. She was almost at the door when the well-dressed one said, not quietly enough to be accidental, "It's the boy I feel for, growing up in a house like that." Eliza stopped. She stood with her back to the 2 women for exactly 3 seconds, counting them deliberately. Then she turned around. "My boy," she said, "is growing up in a house where he is fed and warm and where the man whose roof he sleeps under has shown him more basic decency in 2 weeks than most people manage in a year." She kept her voice level, not cold, level. "If you'd like to talk about him, I'd prefer you do it to my face. That way we both know what's being said." The well-dressed woman opened her mouth. Eliza walked out. Her hands were not shaking until she got to the wagon. Then they shook for about 30 seconds, and she let them. And then she picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch. She told no one what had happened, not Silas, not Holt, who she had begun talking to in the evening sometimes when he sat on the porch after supper, the kind of oblique, unhurried conversation that happened between people who understood each other without needing to say so explicitly. She told no one because there was nothing to tell. She had said what needed to be said and walked out, and now it was done. Except, of course, it wasn't. The following Tuesday, Silas's cousin arrived. Her name was Frances Mercer, and she was the kind of woman who arrived unannounced and somehow still managed to make everyone else feel they should have been expecting her. She was perhaps 45, sharp-faced and sharp-eyed, with the particular confidence of someone who considered themselves the family's designated voice of reason. She had brought a pie, which Eliza recognized immediately as a social gesture that was also a territorial one. Bringing food to a kitchen where another woman was cooking was a very specific kind of message. Silas, to his credit, looked mildly pained the moment he saw her wagon pull in. Frances assessed the kitchen, assessed Eliza, assessed Owen with one brief glance, and then said to Silas, in front of everyone, "I didn't realize the arrangement was so domestic." Silas said, "She cooks. The hands eat. The ranch runs better." "She lives here," Frances said, "in the back room, with her son." "Silas." Frances set the pie on the counter with the particular care of a woman making a point. "People are talking." "People here talk about the weather and make it sound like scandal," Silas said. "I've been listening to it my whole life." Frances looked at Eliza. "I'm not trying to be unkind," she said, which was the thing people always said directly before being unkind. "But you must understand how this looks." Eliza met her eyes. "I understand exactly how it looks. And I understand that how things look and how they are 2 different things. In a town this size," Frances said, "that distinction doesn't protect anyone." "No," Eliza said, "it doesn't." She turned back to the stove. "The pie looks good. I'll put it out after supper." There was a silence that had several things in it. Then Frances said something in a lower voice to Silas, and Silas said something back that Eliza couldn't hear, and Frances's voice came back at a volume that said she'd decided to drop the subject for now, but not forever. Owen, who had been very still in the corner during all of this, waited until Frances had gone into the front room before appearing at Eliza's elbow. "She doesn't like us," he said. "She doesn't know us." "Is that different?" Eliza thought about it. "Yes. Knowing takes time, not liking before you know. That's just habit." Owen processed this. "Can habits change?" "Some of them." "Will hers?" Eliza kept her eyes on the stove. "That's up to her." Frances stayed for 3 hours, had supper, said little to Eliza directly, said a great deal to Silas in the front room after, and left before dark. Silas came back into the kitchen after her wagon disappeared down the road and stood for a moment not saying anything. Eliza didn't ask. If he wanted to tell her, he would. He said, "She means well." "I believe you," Eliza said. "That doesn't always make it better." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at the pie on the counter. "She's actually a decent baker." The crust looked right. Eliza had already noted it with the detached professional appraisal of one cook looking at another cook's work. "Better than mine. I run the butter too warm." Silas looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, slightly surprised. Not at what she'd said, at how she'd said it. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He shook his head. "I just didn't expect you to say something like that." "That her crust is better?" "Most people don't when they think someone else is better at something." Eliza dried her hands on the kitchen towel. "I'm not most people, and knowing where I fall short is more useful to me than pretending I don't." He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. Then he said, "Good night, Mrs. Rowan," and went down the hall. She stood in the kitchen for a while after, the house quiet around her, the stove ticking as it cooled. It was getting easier to be here. That was the dangerous part. The human instinct to soften toward a place that didn't immediately hurt you was something she had to watch carefully. The ranch was not home. The kitchen was not hers. The chair that had stopped wobbling was not a promise. She washed the pie dish, dried it, set it aside. 3 weeks in, Owen got sick. Not dangerously. A chest cold, the kind children caught in changing weather, that settled in and made everything tight and miserable for 5 or 6 days. He ran a low fever for 2 days, slept badly, ate almost nothing. Eliza stayed close, managing the kitchen with one ear always toward the back room, boiling water for steam when his cough got ragged at night, sitting beside his cot in the dark when he couldn't settle. On the 3rd night, she was sitting with him at 2 in the morning when she heard a knock at the door of the back room. Quiet. Not intrusive. She opened it. Silas stood in the hallway with a mug of something. "Honey and hot water with a little ginger," he said. "My mother used to make it." She looked at him. He looked slightly awkward, the way competent people looked when they did something personal and weren't sure of the reception. She took the mug. "Thank you." He looked past her at Owen, who was asleep with one arm thrown over his face. "Fever still up?" "Coming down, slower than I'd like." "He'll be all right." He said it without that particular false confidence that people used when they wanted to end a conversation about illness. He said it like he'd seen enough of the world to know which colds were bad and which weren't, and this one wasn't. She believed him. That surprised her a little. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll check in at breakfast." He went back down the hall. She closed the door and sat back down by Owen's cot and held the warm mug and listened to her son breathe. The honey and ginger worked well enough that Owen slept through to 5 in the morning without coughing. She credited the steam as much as anything, but she didn't throw out the mug. She washed it carefully in the morning and put it back in the cabinet. By the end of the 4th week, something had shifted in the ranch in the specific, unannounced way that things shifted when people spent time working alongside each other without catastrophe. The hands had stopped treating her like a question mark. Cody, the homesick young one, had started leaving his plate near the stove instead of the table so she didn't have to carry it as far, which was a small thing that was also not a small thing. Holt had taken to bringing Owen along when he checked the near fence line in the early mornings. Not every morning, but enough that Owen began looking forward to it, began coming to breakfast with his boots already on, and a certain alert quality to his face that she recognized as anticipation. Owen was, she realized, starting to trust this place. And that was the exact moment the thing she had been braced for finally happened. She had driven into town for supplies, a routine run, nothing unusual, and was tying the horse at the post when she heard her name. Not called out, spoken. By a woman coming out of the dressmaker's shop across the street, to another woman walking beside her. Rowan woman from the Mercer place. She kept her hands on the reins, saying he's practically keeping her there, if you take my meaning. The boy's not even his, but you know men. She had known this was coming, she had braced for it. She had even, in the quiet part of her mind that did inventory at night while she was supposed to be sleeping, rehearsed for it. It still landed the way a flat stone lands in cold water, fast, spreading. She finished tying the horse. She went into the general store. She bought what was on the list. She drove back to the ranch with both hands on the reins and her jaw set in a way that was going to leave her with a headache by evening. She had rebuilt this kitchen from nothing. She had stretched 8 pounds of flour and some dried beans into meals that left empty plates. She had sat up 3 nights running with a sick child in a room that wasn't hers, in a house she had been told was temporary. She had said nothing when Francis Mercer looked at her like a problem to be solved. She had held herself straight on that boarding house porch in front of 3 strangers, and she had not broken. And still. The same story, wearing different clothes. She put the supplies away. She started supper. She kept moving because stopping was the one thing she couldn't afford. Silas came in late that evening, and she had already served the hands and cleaned up, and was sitting at the kitchen table with the account ledger she'd been keeping since Silas asked her to track food costs. She had it in front of her, but she wasn't looking at it. He came in, saw her face, said nothing, and put the kettle on. He poured 2 cups of tea, set one in front of her, sat down across the table. She looked up. "What happened?" he said. "Town." She said it flat. One word. He waited. 2 women outside the dressmaker's. She looked at her hands. "Saying you were keeping me here," in the way they meant it. The kitchen was very quiet. Silas sat with his teacup and looked at the table. His jaw had gone tight in the way she had learned meant he was choosing what to say rather than saying the first thing that came to him. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "It's not yours to be sorry for. It's being said about my house and my—" He stopped. "Your cook," she said. "Yes." But he said it with the slight hesitation that she noticed and then chose not to examine. "Silas." She looked at him directly. "I knew this would happen. I came here knowing it would happen. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. It does. It matters because of Owen, because he's going to start hearing things from other children. And that's the part that I cannot fix from inside this kitchen." She picked up the tea. "I'm telling you because it affects the ranch, and you should know what's being said. Not because I expect you to stop it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. "No," she said. "Not right now." She looked at the ledger. "We're low on lard. I put it on the list." He recognized the change of subject for what it was. "I'll get it tomorrow." "Thank you." They finished the tea in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were starting to understand each other's edges without needing to map them out loud. But when Eliza went to bed that night, she lay awake for a long time looking at the ceiling, listening to Owen breathe in the cot beside her, and she thought about what the women outside the dressmakers had said. She thought about what it would eventually cost Owen to grow up with a mother who lived under a cloud that wouldn't lift no matter how straight she held herself. She thought about the sewing job she had seen posted in the window of a shop on the main street. A small card, neat handwriting, seamstress wanted, respectable work, reasonable pay. She thought about what respectable meant and what it cost and whether you could buy it back once it was taken from you, or whether you just kept paying for someone else's version of it forever. She did not think about the cabinet door that hung straight now. She did not think about the chair that had stopped wobbling. She did not think about honey and ginger at 2 in the morning, or the way Silas had said he'll be all right, and somehow meant it. She tried not to think about those things. She did not entirely succeed. And in the morning, she made breakfast for 9 people and did not let any of it show on her face, and the day went forward the way days did, without asking whether she was ready for it, without waiting, without mercy, and without any particular interest in what she decided to do next. But she had started deciding. And decisions, once started, were very difficult to stop. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It came the way most real decisions came, in pieces, over days, each piece small enough to dismiss on its own until there were too many of them to ignore. It started with Owen. Not something he said, something she saw. She had gone out to the barn one afternoon to bring Holt a message from Silas, and she found Owen sitting on an overturned bucket near the stall of the bay mare. The gentlest of the 7 horses, the one Silas had steered him toward from the first morning. Owen was talking to the horse in a low, steady voice, the way he used to talk to the cat they'd had in Caldwell, the one that died the same winter Thomas did, and the mare had her nose down near his shoulder, not touching, just present. Owen was smiling, not the careful smile he wore when adults were watching him, the one that said, "I'm fine, don't worry about me." The real one. The unguarded one that she hadn't seen since before the bank letter, before the funeral, before all of it. She stood in the barn doorway and watched her son smile at a horse for 30 seconds, and then she went back to the house and stood in the kitchen and understood for the first time fully what she was going to be asking him to give up, because she had already half decided to leave. She knew that. She had known it since the night she lay awake thinking about the sewing job card in the shop window, and the women outside the dressmakers, and what it would eventually cost Owen to have his mother's reputation become the thing people saw before they saw him. She had been circling the decision for a week, checking it from different angles, looking for a way it came out differently. It didn't come out differently. She was going to have to take him away from the mare and the fence line mornings with Holt, and the kitchen that now smelled right, and the chair that didn't wobble anymore, and she was going to have to take him somewhere respectable, and he was going to do what he always did, go quiet and agree and fold the loss somewhere inside himself where she couldn't reach it. She started making quiet arrangements. The sewing job was at a shop called Halcott's, halfway down the main street, run by a woman named Vera Halcott, who was in her 60s and had been taking in fine work for 30 years. Eliza had gone in twice before on supply runs, once to price thread, once to ask about a needle she needed. Vera Halcott was a compact, no-nonsense woman who wore her silver hair pinned tight and looked at everything, including people, with the assessing squint of someone who had spent decades checking stitches. On a Wednesday, while Silas was riding the south fence with 2 of the hands, and Owen was at the barn with Holt, Eliza drove the light wagon into town and went to Halcott's. Vera looked up from behind the counter when she came in, recognized her, said nothing about the ranch or the gossip. "The seamstress card," Eliza said. "Is the position still open?" "It is." Vera put down her work. "What's your experience?" Eliza told her. Plain and accurate, without overstating. She had been mending and sewing since childhood. She could do fine work, buttonholes, seams, alterations, but she wasn't a dressmaker by trade. She was competent and fast and careful with materials. Vera asked her to hem a piece of fabric right there, handed her needle and thread and a folded length of gray wool, and watched without speaking while Eliza worked. Eliza kept her stitches small and even. She didn't rush. When she was done, Vera looked at it, turned it over, looked again. "The position pays $6 a week," Vera said. "Hours are 7 to 4, Tuesday through Saturday. I've got a room above the shop I've been renting out, small, has a cot and a window, $1.50 a week, which comes out of your pay." Eliza did the math. $4.50 clear per week. Enough. Not comfortable, but enough. "There's a boy," Eliza said. "He's 7. He'd be in the room with me." Vera looked at her steadily. "How much trouble does he make?" "Very little." "Does he break things?" "Not intentionally." "That'll do." Vera folded the hemmed piece of wool and set it aside. "You want to start Monday?" Eliza looked at the counter for a moment. "I need a few days to make arrangements. Next Wednesday." "Wednesday, then." Vera picked up her work again. It was the most efficient hiring conversation Eliza had ever been part of, and she appreciated it more than she could have explained. She drove back to the ranch. She told herself she would tell Silas that evening. She told herself this 3 evenings in a row, and each time found a reason. Supper running late, one of the hands needing something, Owen being still awake. To put it off until the following day. She knew she was delaying. She knew why. She was not ready to say it out loud because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that couldn't be walked back. And there was a part of her, a part she wasn't proud of and didn't entirely trust, that wanted to stay in this kitchen for reasons that had stopped being purely practical somewhere around the 2nd week. She told herself it was because the work was steady and Owen was settled and the ranch was functional. She told herself it was not because of the tea at 2 in the morning, or the way Silas sat at the end of his table until everyone else was served, or the very deliberate way he had replaced the word cook with a brief silence that he then covered up by finishing the sentence differently. She told herself a number of things and believed fewer of them than she should have. On a Thursday night, 5 weeks and 3 days after she had arrived at the Mercer Ranch, she waited until the house was quiet and Owen was asleep, and then she went and knocked on the door of the small room Silas used as an office at the end of the hall. He was still up, which she had expected. He kept late hours, she had learned. Not from insomnia, but from the particular kind of man who found that the work of the day wasn't fully processed until everyone else had gone to bed, and he could sit with it quietly. He opened the door. He had a pen in his hand and a look that said he'd been in the middle of something, but he didn't say that. "I need to tell you something," Eliza said. He stepped back to let her in. She shook her head. She didn't want to sit down, didn't want the conversation to get comfortable. She stayed in the doorway. "I've taken a position in town," she said, "at Halcott's sewing shop. I start Wednesday." Silas was quiet for a moment. The pen was still in his hand. "Vera Halcott's," he said. "Yes, she has a room above the shop. Owen and I will move there next week." He looked at her. Not with anger. She had been slightly braced for that, some version of it, because men who were surprised tended to land in anger first, but his face was doing something more complicated and less readable. "Is this because of what's being said in town?" he said. "It's because of what it will do to Owen if we stay. That's the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not. What they're saying is about me. What it does to Owen is about his future. Those aren't the same problem." He set the pen down on the desk behind him. "I told you. What happens on this land is my business. And what happens to my son is mine." She said it without sharpness, just clear. "You've been fair, Silas, more than fair. The work has been good, and the hands have been decent, and Owen has been—" She stopped for a second. "He's been better here than I've seen him since before his father died." She kept her eyes on the wall behind his shoulder because looking at him directly made the next sentence harder. "That's exactly why I have to go. Because I cannot let him build his life on something that the whole town is working to tear down. He'll get hurt worse the longer he has something to lose here." Silas said nothing for a long moment. The lamp on his desk made a slight hiss. "What about the kitchen?" he said. "You'll find another cook." "I didn't find a good one for 3 years before you got here." "That's not my problem to solve." He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she recognized. She had seen it in the mirror often enough. The specific expression of someone deciding not to say a thing they want to say. "All right," he said finally. She had expected more. Some push, some argument, some version of stay because I'm asking you to. The absence of it landed differently than she'd prepared for. "I'll have everything cleared by Tuesday night," she said. "I'll leave the pantry inventory written out so whoever comes next knows what's there." "You don't have to do that." "I know." She stepped back from the doorway. "I want to." She went back down the hall. She went into the back room where Owen was sleeping and sat on the edge of her cot in the dark and looked at the ceiling that no longer leaked. She had done the right thing. She was certain of that. Certainty had always felt better before. She told Owen the next morning while he ate breakfast. She was careful, calm, giving him the shape of it without the weight of it. New room, new job, still in town, not far from here. Owen put his fork down. He didn't cry. He was his mother's son in that particular way. He just looked at his plate for a moment and then looked at her. "Can I still see the horses?" he said. She had no good answer for that. "Sometimes, maybe. If Mr. Mercer allows visitors." Owen picked his fork back up. He finished his breakfast. He carried his plate to the sink without being asked, and then went out the back door toward the barn, and Eliza watched him go and said nothing. He was 7 years old, and he was already learning how to carry things without complaining, and she couldn't decide whether she was proud of him or heartsick about it. Probably both. Usually, it was both. Silas told the hands that morning. She heard the general shape of it from the kitchen. Brief, plain, no editorial. Mrs. Rowan was moving to town next week. He'd be looking for a replacement. That was all. Cody came into the kitchen at noon while she was making the midday meal and stood near the door with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he didn't know what to do with himself. "Heard you're leaving," he said. "Next week." He nodded, looked at the floor. "Biscuits won't be as good," he said. It was the most straightforward compliment she'd received since she arrived, and it came from the youngest and most uncertain person on the property, and she almost laughed and almost cried in approximately equal measure. "I'll write down the recipe," she said. He looked up. "Really? If you find another cook who can read, give it to them." He nodded seriously, as if this were a responsibility he was prepared to honor, and then he went back out, and Eliza turned back to the stove and kept her face pointed away from the room until she had it under control. The weekend before she was supposed to leave, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. Frances Mercer came back. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon with the same unannounced efficiency she'd had the first time, the same pie. Different flavor this time, apple instead of peach. And she found Eliza in the kitchen packing the small collection of things that were hers into the carpet bag she'd arrived with. Frances stood in the doorway and looked at the bag and looked at Eliza and then looked at the bag again. "You're leaving," she said. "Next week." Frances was quiet for a moment. She set the pie down on the counter, the same deliberate placement. And then she said, in a voice that was several tones different from the one she'd used on her first visit, "Is it because of what people are saying?" Eliza looked at her. "Does it matter why?" "I'd like to know." "You'd like to know because you were part of what made it worse," Eliza said. Not cruelly, just honestly. "When you came here the first time and said people are talking loud enough for my son to hear, you added your voice to the people talking." Frances absorbed this. She didn't immediately deny it, which Eliza noted. "I didn't intend," Frances started. "I know you didn't. You intended to protect your cousin. I understand that." Eliza folded a small towel into the bag. It was hers. She'd brought it from Caldwell. "Intentions don't change what a 7-year-old hears." Frances was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the kitchen, the straight cabinet door, the repacked counter crack, the jars of preserved tomatoes lined on the shelf. "You've done a lot here," she said. "It was the job." It was more than the job. Frances said it with some difficulty, the way people said things that cost them. "I came in here ready to disapprove of you, and I want you to know that I was not fair." Eliza looked at her. "No," she said. "You weren't." She let it sit there without cushioning it. Frances nodded once, small and tight. "If you're determined to go," Frances said, "then go well." She looked at the pie. "Take this with you, for the boy." It was not an apology exactly, but it was movement in the direction of one, and Eliza had learned not to demand the full distance when half was already more than most people managed. "Thank you," she said. Frances left without seeing Silas, which Eliza suspected was deliberate. Some things were between women and had no business involving men. Sunday was quiet. Silas worked most of the day on the south fence, came back late, ate in near silence. Owen spent his last full day on the ranch with Holt, trailing the fence line one more time, and came back with mud on his boots and a serious, closed expression that Eliza recognized as his version of her own jaw setting. She didn't press him. She cleaned his boots and let him be. That night, after Owen was in bed, she was doing a final check of the pantry, writing out the inventory, as she'd said she would, when Silas appeared in the kitchen. He was carrying something. It was a blue enamel cup. She recognized the color immediately. Owen had owned a cup like it in Caldwell, a small enamel cup with a blue and white pattern that had been his since infancy, that he drank his morning milk from every day, that had fallen off the back of the wagon somewhere between Caldwell and the first relay town on the road east. She had not seen him cry about it. He was already past crying about individual losses by then, which was its own quiet devastation. But she had noticed him looking at the empty space on the shelf where it had always been. She had not told Silas about the cup. She was certain of that. She had never mentioned it. She looked at the cup in his hand and then looked at him. "How did you know?" she said. He set the cup on the table. "Owen mentioned it to Holt, said he used to have one like it. Holt mentioned it to me." He stepped back. "I picked it up in town a few days ago." She looked at the cup for a long moment. Blue and white. Smaller than the usual mugs. Exactly right. "He'll be happy to have it," she said. "Good." She looked up at him. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. And that was the whole conversation, technically. 2 sentences. But there was a weight in it that 2 sentences couldn't carry by themselves, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. and the silence after was the kind that meant more than most words. She picked up the cup. I'll put it with his things. Good night, Mrs. Rowan. Good night. She went down the hall and placed the blue enamel cup on top of Owen's folded jacket in the bag she'd packed for him, and she stood in the dark room listening to her son breathe for a long time before she went to bed. She left on Monday morning. She had intended to leave quietly, early, efficient, no extended goodbyes. That had been the plan. She had packed the bags on Sunday night, written out the full pantry inventory on a clean sheet of paper, and left it on the kitchen table with a note about the stove's tendency to run hot on the left side and the fact that the flue needed checking after heavy rain. She was up before 4. She had the coffee going by 4:30, force of habit, or stubbornness, or something in between. She set out what she needed for the morning's breakfast. She was not going to leave them with nothing on the table the first morning. That wasn't in her. And worked through the biscuits and the salt pork and the coffee for the last time in that kitchen. At 5:30, Holt came in. He was the first one up, always, which she had learned was his own form of discipline. He looked at the set table and the covered biscuits and the coffee pot and her carpet bag standing by the back door, and he sat down at his end of the table and poured himself a cup. You're leaving now, he said, after the hands are up. You didn't have to make breakfast. I know. He drank his coffee. She finished the last of the cleanup. The kitchen was as clean as she could make it. Holt, she said. Thank you for taking Owen out on the fence line. He looked at her over the cup. Boy needed something to do. Useful is good for kids. It was good for him, more than you probably know. He nodded, set the cup down. He's a good boy, quiet but not weak. That's the good kind of quiet. She turned back to the counter so he wouldn't see her face. The hands came in at 6. They ate without the usual noise. Cody kept his eyes on his plate. The two brothers, for once, didn't argue about anything. Darnell, who never said much, said even less. Silas came in last. He sat at his end of the table. He ate what was on his plate. Nobody said anything exceptional. When the meal was done and the men filed out, Owen came to find her. He had his jacket on already, his bag in his hand, the blue enamel cup visible at the top where he'd placed it himself that morning when she'd given it to him. He had held the cup for a long time when she'd handed it over. He'd turned it around once, looked at the blue pattern, and then looked at her with an expression that was trying to be neutral and failing. Mr. Mercer gave it to you to give to me, he'd said. Not a question. Yes. He had put it carefully in his bag. He hadn't said anything else about it, but he had patted the outside of the bag once, lightly, with one hand, before he zipped it closed. Now he stood in the kitchen doorway with his bag and his jacket and his carefully neutral face and waited. Silas was still at the table. Eliza picked up her carpet bag. She looked at the kitchen one last time. The straight cabinet door, the oilcloth-patched counter, the jars on the shelf, the stove that drew clean now. The inventory's on the table, she said to Silas. The note about the stove is with it. I saw it, he said. Thank you. She nodded. She moved toward the back door. Mrs. Rowan? She stopped. Silas was looking at the table, not at her. If things in town? He stopped, started again. If the situation changes, or if it doesn't work out, the offer stands. She looked at the back of his head, his shoulders, the way he was holding the edge of the table without appearing to hold it. I know, she said. She went out the back door. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that had edges to it, that pressed through a coat and reminded you it was still there. She loaded the bags into the wagon that Silas had already arranged to have taken into town by Cody later. She would walk, she had decided, because she needed the air, and because being in a wagon felt too much like being transported and not enough like choosing. Owen walked beside her. After a few minutes, he said, Will the horses be all right without us? They'll be fine. They're ranch horses. This is what they do. Holt will look after them. Holt will look after them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what about Holt? She looked at him. What about him? Who looks after Holt? She had no answer for that. She didn't try to manufacture one. She just put her hand on the back of his head the same way she had on the boarding house porch the first day, and they kept walking. The town appeared ahead of them, the buildings taking shape in the early light, the main street still quiet, the sign for Halcott's visible from the edge of the road. Eliza had a room and a job and $43 that had somehow lasted this far. She also had a son who was walking beside her without complaint, and a blue enamel cup in a bag, and the knowledge that she had kept a kitchen so well that 8 men had eaten properly for 5 weeks, which was more than had been accomplished there in the 3 years before she arrived. She was not nothing. It was important in moments like this to remember that she was not nothing. They crossed into town. The morning was getting lighter. Somewhere behind them, 4 miles out on the road east, a ranch dog was probably already making its first slow patrol of the yard, and a stove was going cold in a kitchen where the cabinet door hung straight, and a chair sat at a table that didn't wobble, and a man who said very little and fixed things without being asked was drinking the last of the coffee she'd made. She didn't look back, but she knew, walking into Forsyth Creek in the cold October morning with her son beside her and her bag in her hand, that leaving a place was not the same as being free of it, and arriving somewhere new was not the same as being safe there. She had learned that much. She pushed open the door to Halcott's. Vera was already behind the counter, exactly where Eliza had expected her to be, with her silver hair pinned and her reading glasses on, and a length of dark fabric laid out in front of her that needed attention. She looked up. "Room's unlocked," she said. "Stairs are in the back. Breakfast is your own business." "Understood," Eliza said. "Work starts at 7. "I'll be ready." Vera looked at Owen. Owen looked at Vera with the polite, watchful expression he wore around adults he hadn't calibrated yet. "You the boy?" Vera said. "Yes, ma'am." "You'll be quiet during work hours." "Yes, ma'am." "And you won't touch the fabric bolts." "No, ma'am." Vera looked at Eliza. "He'll do," she said, and went back to her work. Eliza took Owen upstairs. The room was small. That hadn't been an exaggeration. 1 window, 1 cot, a narrow table, a hook on the wall. The floor was clean and the window glass was intact, and the cot had a wool blanket folded at the end of it. Owen looked around the room with the particular thoroughness of a child taking stock. "It's small," he said. "It is." "Smaller than the back room at the ranch." "Yes." He went to the window and looked out at the main street below, just starting to come to life. A man with a delivery cart, a woman opening the bakery across the way, 2 horses tied at the far post. "I can see the whole street from here," he said. "You can." He turned around. He was still holding his bag. He looked at her with those eyes she'd known since he was born, not asking for a promise, not asking for anything she couldn't give, just checking that she was still there, still steady. "It'll be okay," he said. She hadn't said that. He had. She set her bag down on the floor and crossed to where he was standing and put both arms around him and held on, which she didn't do often enough, and he didn't ask for often enough, and both of them needed more than either of them said. He held on too. His bag bumped against her leg. After a moment he said, muffled against her shoulder, "The cup didn't break." "I know. I was careful with it." "I know you were." She let go. She straightened up. She looked at the small room with its single window and its 1 wool blanket and its hook on the wall and the bare floor and the narrow table, and she thought, this is what you have. This is what's real right now. Then she started unpacking. Outside, the town of Forsyth Creek went about its morning, and the debt ledgers in the bank branch sat where they always sat, and the women who talked outside the dressmakers were already somewhere talking, and the boarding house with the brass fish knocker had its door closed against the cold. None of that had changed. But Eliza Rowan was unpacking her bag in a room she had chosen and a job she had taken on her own terms, and her son was setting a blue enamel cup on the narrow table by the window where the morning light would hit it just right. And for this one specific moment, that was enough to stand on. She knew, with the same quiet certainty that lived below hope and above despair, that the peace of this room was already fragile, that the debt still existed in some ledger somewhere with Thomas's name and hers beside it in the minds of people who wanted something to be owed to them. That respectable work in a respectable shop would help, but would not erase. That time moved slowly in small towns, and memory moved slower. She knew the ground beneath her was not solid yet, but she was standing on it, and she intended to keep standing. What she did not know, could not have known, standing there in that small room above the sewing shop, was that the ground was about to shift in a way she hadn't prepared for, and that the ledger she had been afraid of would become, within days, the center of something she had not imagined anyone doing for her. She put her mother's photograph on the table beside the blue enamel cup. She went to work. The first 3 days at Halcott's were the quietest Eliza had known since before Thomas died. Not peaceful quiet, working quiet. The kind that came from a task that required enough attention to keep the mind occupied, but not so much that it crowded out everything else. She sat at the long work table in the back room of the shop, with fabric and needle, and the particular focused stillness of a woman who had been doing this kind of work her whole life. And she was good at it, and being good at something uncomplicated was its own form of relief. Vera Halcott ran a tight operation. The shop opened at 7, closed at 4, and in between those hours the work was steady and the expectations were clear. Vera did the customer-facing work, the fittings, the consultations, the careful management of women who wanted something that didn't quite exist in the fabric they'd chosen. And Eliza did the production work in the back, hems, alterations, repairs. The occasional full garment when Vera had more orders than her own hands could manage. They worked in relative silence, which suited them both. Vera was not unfriendly, but she was economical with words in the way of someone who had spent decades in a profession where precision mattered and chattiness wasted thread. She said what needed saying. She didn't fill quiet with noise. Owen, for his part, was almost alarmingly well-behaved. He sat in the corner of the back room during work hours with a book Holt had pressed into his hands on their last morning at the ranch, a battered collection of frontier stories, the cover half detached. And he read with the focused quiet of a child who had learned early that being unobtrusive was the safest way to be allowed to stay somewhere. He didn't touch the fabric bolts. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then in a low voice that barely carried. Eliza watched him be careful and wished he didn't have to be. On the 4th day, the trouble began. It started at the dry goods store 2 doors down. She had gone in on her lunch break for a small tin of lard, her own, for the room upstairs where she sometimes heated simple things on the small iron plate Vera let her use. The owner, a thin man named Peel, who wore his hair parted with mathematical precision, looked at her across the counter with the particular expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Mr. Peel. Here you're at Halcott's now." "That's right." He nodded, pulled the lard tin, set it on the counter. Then he said, without looking at her, "Branch manager was in this morning, asking around about you." Eliza felt the familiar tightening. "Asking what specifically?" "About your husband's account. Whether you'd establish credit anywhere in town. Whether you were—" He paused. "Settling in," was how he put it. "And what did you tell him?" "That you'd paid cash for everything you bought here." He looked up then. "Which is the truth." "It is." She put her coins on the counter. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded, said nothing else. She took the tin and left. She ate her lunch on the stairs behind the shop and thought about what settling in meant to a bank branch manager who was trying to determine whether a widow with attached debts was becoming enough of a local fixture to be worth pursuing. She had known this was coming too. She had known it the way she knew winter was coming. Not the exact date, but the certainty of it, the way the air changed before it arrived. She told herself it was manageable. She told herself this with less conviction than she'd managed before. That evening, she wrote a letter to the bank in Caldwell. She had written versions of this letter in her head a dozen times since Thomas died, calm, factual, specific. She wrote it again now on actual paper, laying out what she understood to be the legal situation regarding a spouse's liability for debts she had not signed for, asking for written confirmation of what was owed and to whom and in what name, and sending it care of the Forsyth Creek Post Office with a return address of Halcott's. She did not know if it would help. She sent it anyway. The following Monday, she went to Cartwright's general store for a supply run, her own supplies this time, not the ranch's, and stood in line at the counter behind a woman she didn't know and a man she recognized from the feed store. When she reached the counter, Cartwright looked at his ledger and then looked at her and said, in the tone of a man reporting a weather condition rather than making a judgment, "I've got instructions from the branch manager not to extend credit to any account connected to the Rowan name." Eliza looked at him. "I wasn't asking for credit," she said. "I know. I'm telling you because if you were going to ask, or if you were thinking of opening an account—" He looked slightly uncomfortable. "It's not my decision. I understand that. I can take cash." I have cash, Mr. Cartwright. She put her money on the counter. I've had cash since I arrived here. I've paid cash for everything. I know, he said again, and then lower. I told him that. She looked at him. He wasn't a bad man. She had understood that from the beginning. He was a man in a small town who operated within the systems of that town, and occasionally, when it cost him very little, bent them slightly toward fairness. The limit of his courage was Cartwright's general store, and that was what it was. Give me what's on the list, she said. He did. She walked back to Halcott's with the supplies and went straight to the back room and picked up her needle and started a hem and did not let her hand shake until she had the first 6 stitches in, which gave her enough to focus on that the shaking mostly stopped. Vera appeared in the doorway at some point and looked at the speed of Eliza's stitching, which was somewhat faster than optimal. Something happened, Vera said. Bank branch manager is making inquiries about me. Vera leaned against the doorframe. Prescott? I don't know his name. Older man? Looks like he's been sucking on something sour for the past 20 years? That sounds approximately right. Vera made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Prescott has been that branch manager for 15 years and has the imagination of a fence post. What does he want? My husband died with debts. I wasn't a signatory, but Prescott apparently doesn't find that a sufficient answer. He can't legally pursue you for debts you didn't sign for. No. But he can make merchants nervous about me. He can make it so that my name comes with a flag on it in every establishment in this town. She kept her eyes on the hem. He can make it so that Owen gets looked at differently at school, so that when he's old enough to need credit for something, my name is still the first thing that comes up. Vera was quiet for a moment. You wrote to the bank in Caldwell, she said. Eliza looked up. How did you know I would do that? Because it's the first sensible thing to do and you strike me as a sensible woman. Vera pushed off the doorframe. Get a written statement of the debt, in whose name, and have it confirmed in writing that you are not a signatory. Then Prescott has nothing to wave around that actually has your name on it. That's what I did. Good. Vera went back to the front. Slow your stitching down. You're pulling the fabric. Eliza looked at the hem. She was, slightly. She adjusted her tension and kept going. She had been at Halcott's 8 days when Silas came into the shop. She heard the bell above the front door and didn't look up from her work. Customers were Vera's domain, not hers. She heard Vera's measured greeting, and then a voice she recognized, and her hand stilled over the fabric. She set the work down and came to the doorway between the back room and the shop. Silas was standing near the counter with his hat in his hand, which she had come to understand was a specific gesture with him. The hat came off when he was in a situation he was approaching with some deliberateness. He looked at her across the shop. Mrs. Rowan, he said. Mr. Mercer. She came out of the back room. Vera had gone through to the storage area with the particular tact of a woman who understood when to be elsewhere. Is something wrong at the ranch? No. He looked around the shop briefly, not with curiosity, just with the automatic inventory of a man who looked at spaces and noted what was in them. Everything's running. Holt's managing. Good. He looked at her. I heard about Prescott. She should not have been surprised. Small town. It's being handled, is it? I wrote to the bank in Caldwell. I'm waiting for a written statement. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the hat in his hands once. Not nervously, more like he was working through something. I know Prescott, he said. Knew his father. That branch has done business with my family for 40 years. She looked at him carefully. I appreciate you coming to tell me, but this is something I need to handle I already talked to him, Silas said. She stopped. This morning, he said. I went to the branch before I came here. She stared at him. You went to the bank branch manager? Yes. About me. About the situation. He met her eyes without flinching. I told him that you'd been employed on my property, that you'd managed my accounts honestly for over a month, and that any implication that you were a credit risk based on your late husband's debts was both legally questionable and personally insulting to someone who had conducted herself with more integrity than most people he'd likely deal with this year. The shop was very quiet. Silas, she said. He said the inquiries were standard procedure. They may well be. I told him that standard procedure that was being used to make a woman's life more difficult than it needed to be was not a procedure I was interested in supporting with 40 years of Mercer family business. She looked at him for a long moment. Something was moving in her chest that she didn't quite have a name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly, though it was partly that. It was something more complicated. Something that had to do with having been defended without being asked by someone who had nothing to gain from it. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "No. I was handling it." "I know you were." He looked at her steadily. "That doesn't mean you had to handle it alone." She didn't respond immediately. She looked at the counter, at the fabric samples laid out on it, at the wall behind his shoulder. "What did he say?" she said. "After. He said he'd review the situation." Silas's expression said he found this answer insufficient, but had accepted it as what was available, which means he'll back off the merchants for now and see whether there's anything worth pursuing legally, which there isn't once you have the Caldwell letter. The letter may take 2 weeks. "I know." He looked at his hat. "In the meantime, I told Cartwright this morning that any difficulty he had extending normal courtesy to you was a difficulty I'd take note of when it came time to place the ranch's supply orders." She stared at him. "You went to Cartwright too." "He's the main merchant. The others follow his lead." "Silas." She was not angry. She was something else. Something that didn't have a clean label and was making her voice slightly unsteady in a way she didn't like. "You can't fight I'm not fighting anything." He said it plainly. "I'm making it clear that how people treat you has consequences. That's not fighting. That's just how things work." He looked at her. "Cartwright's a practical man. He'll calculate it and land in the right place." She put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the wood grain. "People will say you're doing this because of—" She stopped. "Because of what?" She looked up at him. "You know what they're saying about why you'd go to this trouble for a cook who doesn't even work for you anymore." He held her gaze. "Let them say it. It'll make things worse for you. Your reputation—" "My reputation," he said, "can handle a man standing up for someone being treated unfairly. If it can't, it wasn't worth much to begin with." She looked at him for a long moment. I was standing there in the middle of Vera Halcott's shop with his hat in his hands and mud still on his boots from whatever he'd been doing before this, and he had gone to a bank branch manager and a general store owner before noon on a Monday morning on her behalf, without being asked, without making a performance of it. And now he was looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated expression of a man who had done something because it seemed necessary and was not particularly interested in being thanked for it. It was the most undramatic act of decency she had witnessed in a very long time, and it cracked something in her that she had been keeping carefully sealed. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she said things when she meant them at a level below what the words could actually carry. He nodded. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "The job here, handling it on your own terms. I know that." He turned the hat once more. "I just didn't want you to have to do it with one hand tied behind your back." He left. The bell above the door rang once, and then the shop was quiet. Vera appeared from the storage room approximately 4 seconds later, which suggested she had been standing just inside that door for most of the conversation. Eliza looked at her. "Say nothing," Eliza said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Vera said, and then, after a pause, "He's a decent man." "I know. That's not as common as it should be." "I know that too." Vera went back behind the counter. "The Whitmore hem needs finishing by 3. Eliza went back to the hem, but she sat with the needle in her hand for a moment before she started, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the specific weight of someone having done a thing for her that she hadn't known she needed done until it was done. The Caldwell letter arrived on a Friday, 11 days after she'd sent hers. She recognized the bank's letterhead immediately when Vera handed it to her with the morning's mail. She opened it at the work table with her tea going cold beside her. It was clear. Formal language, but clear. Thomas Rowan, deceased, had held a personal loan in his name alone. His widow, Eliza Rowan, had not been a signatory to the loan or any associated account. The debt was recorded against the estate of Thomas Rowan, which had been settled at a loss to the bank. The bank made no claim against Eliza Rowan personally and held no record of any debt in her name. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, next to where she used to keep the other letter. The one from Thomas's creditors, the one that had traveled with her from Caldwell and had been refolded so many times the creases were almost holes. That letter was gone now, left behind in the move somewhere, or thrown away during one of the sleepless nights when she'd been tired of looking at it. She hadn't noticed exactly when it had disappeared, which was probably how it should go. In its place now. Now a letter that said her name was her own. She went to the bank branch that afternoon. She asked to see Prescott. She was kept waiting for 12 minutes, she counted, before being shown into a small office that smelled of paper and something that had been spilled on the carpet years ago and never fully resolved. Prescott was the man Vera had described. Late 60s, face arranged in an expression of permanent mild displeasure. He looked at her across the desk with the professional neutrality of a man who had made other people uncomfortable for so long it had become reflexive. She put the Caldwell letter on his desk. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The slight recalibration of a man who had been counting on a card that wasn't there. "This resolves the question of the debt," he said. "It does. Any credit you wish to establish here would be in your own name." "That was always the case." She kept her voice level. "I'd like that noted in your branch records. My name carries no debt and no claim against it." He looked at her for a moment. "That's standard procedure. Once. I'd like it confirmed in writing," she said. "Today." Another pause. Longer. The kind that was supposed to make her feel the smallness of what she was asking for. She let it sit there and didn't fill it. He opened a drawer, pulled a form, wrote something, signed it, stamped it, pushed it across the desk. She read it before she picked it up. It said what it needed to say. "Thank you," she said. She walked out of the bank branch with the Caldwell letter and the branch confirmation both in her coat pocket and stood on the main street of Forsyth Creek in the thin October light and breathed, just breathed. She went back to Halcott's, hung up her coat, and finished the afternoon's work. She did not go to the general store that day, or the next. On Wednesday, she did. She went to Cartwright's for a small order. The usual things, nothing excessive. Cartwright was behind the counter. He looked at her, looked at the list, and began filling it. He gave her the better cut of salt pork without being asked. When she went to pay, he said, without looking up from the register, "I heard you went to see Prescott." "I did." "He tell the others?" "I don't know what he told anyone." Cartwright was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your money's good here, Mrs. Rowan. Same as anyone else's. Same as it always was." He looked up. "I should have said so earlier." It was as close to an apology as Cartwright was going to get. She recognized it for what it was. "I appreciate that," she said. She paid for her things and left. She thought about Silas on the walk back, about what he had said in the shop. That's just how things work. As if it had been nothing, as if going to a bank manager and a general store owner on behalf of a woman who wasn't his employee anymore was just the natural, obvious response to an unfair situation. She had spent most of her life having to argue for what was obvious, having to prove what should have been assumed, having to explain herself to rooms full of people who had already decided what she was. Silas had just walked into a room and said, "No." She didn't know exactly what to do with that. She was still working it out. The following Saturday, Owen went missing. Not dramatically, not dangerously. But she finished her work at 4 o'clock and went upstairs to the room, and he wasn't there, and his jacket was gone. And the blue enamel cup was still on the table, so she knew he hadn't run, but he was not where he was supposed to be, and it was getting dark. She went downstairs and asked Vera, who said she hadn't seen him leave but thought she'd heard the back door around 3. Eliza went out the back and down the alley and asked the baker across the way, who said he'd seen a boy heading east on the side road about an hour ago. East. She stood in the alley and thought about what was east of town, 4 miles east. She went back inside and got her coat and told Vera she needed to go and walked east on the side road with her coat buttoned against the cold and the light fading fast. She found him about 1.5 miles out, sitting on a fence post at the edge of a field, looking at nothing in particular. He heard her coming, her footsteps on the hard road, and turned around. His expression was not guilty. It was the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had decided it was worth it anyway. She stopped in front of him. "Owen," she said. "I was just sitting," he said. "You were sitting on a fence post 1.5 miles from town without telling anyone where you were going." "I knew where I was going. That's not the same thing." He looked at his hands. "I wanted to see if I could see the ranch from here." She looked east, down the road. In the distance, just at the edge of visibility in the fading light, there was the dark shape of a tree line that might have been the edge of Mercer property. "Can you?" she said. Just barely. He was quiet for a moment. I miss the horses. I know. Holt said I could come visit, before we left. He looked at her. Did he mean it? Probably. Is it allowed? She looked at her son on the fence post with the last of the light behind him and the road stretching east, and she thought about what it cost a child to ask permission for the things he missed. Yes, she said. It's allowed. He got down from the fence post. She put her hand on the back of his neck the way she did, and they walked back toward town together. Mama, he said after a while. Yes. Do you miss it too? She kept her eyes on the road ahead. The town lights were starting to come up in the distance. Yes, she said. She said it simply because lying to him had never worked, and she had stopped trying years ago. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. They walked the rest of the way in the particular quiet of two people who understood each other without having to fill the space between them with words. That night, after Owen was asleep, Eliza sat at the narrow table by the window with the letter from the Caldwell Bank and the confirmation from Prescott's branch laid flat in front of her, and she looked at her own name in clean black ink. Eliza Rowan, no debt in this name, no claim against. And she thought about what came next. She had a job. She had a room. She had 2 documents that said her name was her own again. She had handled it, all of it. And Owen had been sitting on a fence post trying to see a ranch that was 4 miles away. And she had said yes when she was asked if she missed it, and the yes had been the truest single syllable she'd spoken in weeks. She folded the letters and put them in her coat pocket and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the narrow room above the sewing shop and listened to the town quiet down around her. The last wagon, the last voices on the street, the bakery going dark across the way. And she thought about the kitchen with the straight cabinet door and the stove that ran hot on the left side and the chair that didn't wobble, and the man who fixed things without being asked and went to bank managers without being thanked and stood in a hat shop with his hat in his hands and said, I just didn't want you to have to do it with one hand tied behind your back. She thought about what it felt like to have someone stand in front of the thing that was trying to diminish you and simply say, no. She had been doing it herself for years. She was good at it. She was in fact better at it than most people, and she knew it. But there was a difference, and she had not let herself feel this difference clearly until now, in the dark, with her son asleep 3 feet away and her name clean on paper in her coat pocket. There was a difference between standing up for yourself because you had no one else and standing up for yourself while someone stood beside you. She had not had the second in a very long time, maybe ever, if she was being honest. Thomas had been a man with intentions larger than his capacities, and she had loved him, and she had also spent most of their marriage quietly compensating for the gap between what he meant and what he managed. She had not in that marriage had a partner. She had had a husband, which was not always the same thing. Silas had stood in that shop and said, I just didn't want you to have to do it alone. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. She was not making a decision tonight. She was exhausted, and it was late, and she knew from experience that decisions made in the dark after an emotional day were usually decisions that needed to be remade in the morning light anyway. But she let herself hold, for the length of one careful breath, the thought that the room above the sewing shop, with its single window and its one wool blanket and its small iron plate for heating things, was not necessarily the end of anything. It might be what it was, like a bridge, a pause, a middle place between what she had survived and what she had not yet let herself consider. It might be that. She slept. And in the morning, before she started work, she did something she had not planned to do. She wrote a note, short, practical. It said, Owen would like to visit the horses. If this is agreeable, we could come Sunday afternoon. E. Rowan. She gave it to the postal runner who came through at 7:30. Then she went into the back room, picked up her needle, and started on the day's first hem. Her hands were steady. They had been for a while now. The reply came back the same day she sent the note. She didn't expect that. She had expected a day, maybe 2. The postal runner going out in the morning and returning by afternoon was not guaranteed, and Silas was not a man who sat waiting near the door for correspondence. But the runner came back through Halcott's at 2:30 with a folded paper that had her name on the front, in handwriting she recognized from the pantry inventory she'd left on the kitchen table. She opened it at the work table with Vera pretending not to notice from the other end of the room. It said, Sunday is fine. Come when you like. The bay mare will be glad of the company. S. Mercer. And below that, in slightly different pen pressure, as if added after a pause, so will the rest of us. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the bank letters and went back to the hem she was working on. She said nothing. Vera said nothing. The afternoon proceeded. But something had shifted again, the way things kept shifting around this particular situation. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just quietly, and with the particular inevitability of things that had been moving in a direction for a while and finally arrived. Sunday came cold and bright, the kind of October morning that was almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what was coming behind it. Eliza dressed Owen in his warmest things, and they walked the 4 miles east on the road. She now knew well enough to walk without thinking about it, and Owen was quiet the whole way out, but it was a different quiet than his usual careful silence. It was the quiet of anticipation, of someone moving towards something rather than bracing against it. The ranch looked the same. The dog came out from under the porch and barked once and went back under. The barn door was open. The gate still leaned slightly. Owen saw the horses before they were through the yard gate. He stopped walking. The bay mare was in the near paddock, not the barn, which Eliza suspected was not accidental. She was standing near the fence in the pale morning sun with her ears up, and when Owen made a small sound, she turned her head toward him with the unhurried attention of an animal that had learned a long time ago to distinguish between people worth looking at and people worth ignoring. Owen looked at his mother. "Go," Eliza said. He went, not running. He never ran toward horses, Holt had taught him that, but walking fast, with barely contained urgency. And when he reached the fence and put his hand through the rail, the mare came to him like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he hadn't been gone 6 weeks, and Owen pressed his forehead against the side of her face and stood there. Eliza watched from the yard gate and let him have it. Silas appeared from the direction of the barn. He had been working. She could tell by the tools in his hand and the fact that he hadn't come out to meet them immediately, which told her he had intentionally given them a moment to arrive without the pressure of being received. That was thoughtful in a way that was becoming characteristic of him. Not showy, just considered. He stopped beside her at the gate and looked at Owen at the fence. She remembered him, Silas said. Apparently. Horses do that. People underestimate it. They stood there for a moment side by side, watching the boy and the mare, and it was comfortable in a way that Eliza had stopped trying to explain to herself. She had spent 6 weeks trying to put careful distance between herself and this exact feeling, and it had not worked particularly well, and she was tired of the effort. "The note," she said. "What you added at the end." He was quiet for a moment. "What about it? Did you mean it?" He turned and looked at her. He was still holding the tools, which she suspected he'd forgotten were in his hand. "Yes," he said. "I meant it." She looked at Owen at the fence. "I meant what I said when I left, about needing to do this on my own terms." "I know." "I still mean it." "I know that too." She turned to look at him, "But I also—" She stopped, started again. "I handled it. The bank. Prescott. The letter from Caldwell. I handled all of it." "You did. And you helped." "Some. More than some." She held his gaze. "I'm not good at accepting that. I want you to know that going in. I have a very specific difficulty with letting people do things for me, because in my experience, things that people do for you come with a price that gets named later." He nodded slowly. "Thomas. Thomas. And before Thomas. And after." She looked back at Owen. "I'm not saying that about you. I'm saying it about myself. It's something I'm working on." "All right. I'm not finished." He waited. "I left because it was the right thing for Owen. I still believe that. The town needed to see that I could stand on my own without—" She stopped again. "Without it looking like someone was standing me up. And now?" She looked at the ranch, the barn, the bunkhouse, the outbuildings, the gate that leaned, the fence that needed paint, the kitchen window where she had stood washing dishes and looking out at the yard every morning for 5 weeks. "Now I've stood on my own," she said. "I have a job and a room, and my name is clear, and I did that, not because someone fixed it for me." She paused. And I'm still standing here on a Sunday morning because my son missed a horse and because I... She stopped one more time and then made herself finish it. Because I missed this, the work of this, the ordinary of it. She looked at him. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just telling you the truth because I'm tired of being careful with it. Silas set the tools down on the top rail of the gate. He looked at her with the direct, undefended look he'd had that first day across the street in Forsyth Creek. The look of a man who had already decided something and wasn't second-guessing it. I want to say something, he said, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. All right. I've been running this ranch alone for 8 years. Before you, I had 2 cooks that weren't good, and one that was but left to get married, and 8 men eating whatever Holt could cobble together on the bad weeks. And I told myself it was fine, because fine is what you tell yourself when you've stopped expecting better. He picked the tools back up, then seemed to realize again that he was holding them and set them down again. When you walked into that kitchen on the first night and cleared the flue and had supper on the table in 2 hours, I thought, all right, she can do the work. But then I watched you manage those men, and manage the supplies, and manage Owen getting sick, and manage Frances showing up with her opinions, and manage the town and Cartwright and Prescott and all of it, and what I thought after a while was, I've been waiting a long time for a person like this, and I didn't know I was waiting. Eliza was quiet. I'm not asking you to come back because the kitchen needs a cook, he said. The kitchen needs a cook, but that's not why I'm asking. He looked at her steadily. I'm asking because you belong here, not because you owe me anything, not because you have nowhere else to go. You've proven that past any argument, but because this is where things work, with you here. I don't know how else to say it more plainly than that. She looked at him for a long time. The bay mare made a sound in the paddock. Owen laughed. The real laugh, the unguarded one. You're asking me to come back, she said. Yes. As what? He held her gaze. As whatever you'll agree to start. She looked at the kitchen window. She thought about the narrow room above Halcott's shop, which was fine. It was genuinely fine. It was clean and honest and hers, and she had no complaints about it except that it was small and cold in the mornings, and Owen had to whisper during work hours, and the view was a street rather than a yard. She thought about the Caldwell letter in her coat pocket and what it represented. A name that was hers alone, free of debt, free of claim, free. She thought about what free actually meant. She had spent so long treating it as the absence of obligation that she had almost missed the other half of the word, the part where free meant free to choose, not just free from. Vera will need notice, she said. Something moved through Silas's face, not a smile exactly, something quieter than that. Of course. 2 weeks at least. She's been fair to me, and I'm not going to leave her without time to arrange. Understood. And the room above the shop was in the arrangement. I'll need to sort that. There's a room here, same one. I know. She looked at him. Owen keeps his mornings with Holt, if Holt agrees. Holt will agree. He's been asking about the boy since the week you left. She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, organizing the pieces of it in her mind. Not nervously, more the way she organized a pantry, placing each thing where it made sense. Silas, she said, what are we doing here? Plainly. He looked at her without wavering. Plainly. I'd like to see where this goes. Between us. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, except whether you're willing to find out. She had not been asked that before. Not like that. Not with that specific combination of directness and patience, without pressure, without performance. I'm willing to find out, she said. He picked up the tools again. She thought he was going to say something more, some larger statement, some sealing of the moment. He didn't. He just nodded, once, the same way Holt nodded when something had been understood and didn't need repeating. Then he said, I need to finish the barn door before the cold comes in tonight. You and Owen want to stay for noon meal? We'll stay for noon meal, she said. He went back to the barn. She stayed at the gate and watched Owen at the fence with the mare, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not romanticized, not larger than it was, but real. A choice made in daylight by 2 people who had both learned, the hard way, what it cost to be wrong about things, and who were choosing, with open eyes, to try anyway. She gave Vera notice the following Monday. Vera received it with the same economical composure she received everything. She looked at the 2-week notice, looked at Eliza, and said, "The Mercer Ranch." "Yes." "The man came to the shop last month." "He did." Vera was quiet for a moment, then she picked up her work. "I'll need someone to finish the Grantham order before you go. The blue wool, 3 alterations. I'll have it done by Thursday." "Good." And then after a pause, "You do good work, Mrs. Rowan, wherever you work." It was from Vera Halcott, nearly equivalent to a standing ovation. Eliza took it as such. The 2 weeks were ordinary in the way that transitional periods sometimes were, everything continuing as normal, while underneath it, something was quietly rearranging itself. She finished the Grantham order and 2 others. She organized the back room in a way that would make sense to whoever came next. On the last day, Vera handed her 2 weeks extra pay and said it was for not leaving her short on orders, and Eliza said she hadn't earned extra, and Vera said she'd earned it twice over, and they looked at each other and the matter was closed. Owen packed his own bag this time. He folded each thing carefully and placed the blue enamel cup in the center, cushioned by his spare shirt. He had been measured and calm about the return in the particular way he had, processing internally, showing very little on the surface, until the moment they turned off the main road onto the track east, and he started walking faster without appearing to notice he was doing it. Holt was in the yard when they arrived. He looked at Owen coming through the gate. "Thought you'd be back," he said. "You did?" Owen said. "Yep." Holt turned and headed toward the near fence line. "Come on then, that section of wire's not going to check itself." Owen dropped his bag on the porch and followed without being asked, his boots hitting the hard ground at a trot to keep up, and Eliza stood in the yard and watched them go with something in her chest that was too large and too complicated to name, and so she didn't try. She picked up the bags and went inside. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it, cabinet door straight, counter repacked, the jars of preserved tomatoes still on the shelf. One fewer, someone had used one, which meant Holt had figured out what to do with them, which was more than she'd expected. The stove was cold. She built the fire. It took longer than usual. The kindling was damp at the bottom of the stack from a wet week, and she had to work with what was dry enough. And the first 2 attempts caught and then stuttered out, and she sat back on her heels and looked at the firebox and thought about how very little in this life lit on the first try. The 3rd attempt held. By the time Silas came in at noon, there was a proper fire in the stove and the smell of coffee and the beginning of something for the midday meal. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of this and then looked at her. "Welcome back," he said. "Thank you," she said. "The kindling's damp. You'll want to bring in the stack from the far side of the barn. I'll get Cody on it." "Good." He almost smiled. She saw it. She let it go without comment. Months passed the way months did on working land. Not gently, not dramatically, but with the steady accumulation of small things that built, without announcement, into something that mattered. Cody learned to make biscuits. He was terrible at them for 4 weeks, and then one morning they came out right, and he looked at them with the stunned expression of someone who had achieved something they had stopped believing was possible. Eliza told him they were acceptable without enthusiasm, which from her he had learned was praise, and he ate 3 of them standing at the counter. Darnell started talking more. Not a lot, but enough that she began to understand that his silences had always been selective rather than constitutional, that he was funny in a dry, sidelong way that only appeared when he felt safe enough to let it, and that he had strong opinions about horses and no opinions about most other things, which Eliza found restful. The 2 brothers, whose names were Cal and Dennis, thought about everything all the time and were clearly deeply attached to each other and would probably have been lost without the friction of the other's company. She stopped trying to manage their arguments and started treating them as background noise, which was what they were. Holt continued to take Owen on the fence line checks. Owen grew half an inch by Eliza's measurement against the kitchen doorframe and got a back tooth and could now brush down the bay mare from Withers to Hawk without needing to be corrected. He started doing it every morning before breakfast, which Holt had not suggested and Silas had not required, and Owen had simply decided was his responsibility, because he was a child who, once he trusted a place, committed to it entirely. He started at the school in town in November. Eliza had braced for that. The other children would know her name, would have heard things, and children were not always kind about what they heard. The first week was hard. A boy named Garrett said something about the ranch and what Garrett's mother had said about it, And Owen came home with his jaw set in the exact way Eliza's jaw set and said nothing about it until supper, when Silas asked how school had been, and Owen said, "There's a boy who talks about things he doesn't know about." Silas said, "What'd you do?" Told him that talking about things you don't know about makes you look smaller, not the person you're talking about. Silas looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at her plate. "And?" Silas said. "He pushed me." "And?" "I didn't push back." Owen moved food around his plate. Holt said fighting is for when there's no other option and other options hadn't run out yet. "That's correct," Silas said. "He called me a name the next day." "What'd you do?" "Told him he was going to have to find something better than that because it wasn't working." Owen finally looked up. Then Jimmy Pierce laughed at him, and he stopped. Silas nodded, said nothing more. Eliza picked up her fork and kept her face pointed at her plate and said nothing either, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish the thing Owen had just reported. Not a victory exactly, but something better than a victory, which was a demonstration of his own good sense in a situation designed to undermine it. She was, she realized, extraordinarily proud of him. She was also starting to understand that she had been so focused on protecting him that she had slightly underestimated how much resilience he had already built on his own, in the quiet ways of children who had learned early that the world would not arrange itself kindly on their behalf. He was going to be all right. She had known it intellectually. She was starting to feel it, which was different and more necessary. In December, Frances came again. Eliza had been half expecting it. When Frances Mercer did things, she did them in patterns, and the pattern with Eliza appeared to be arrive, assess the situation, say something that cost her something, leave, repeat, when enough time had passed to warrant a new assessment. This time Frances arrived with no pie. She arrived with a length of dark green wool fabric, good quality, folded under her arm, and she handed it to Eliza in the kitchen doorway without preamble. "I want a dress made," Frances said, "for the Alderman Christmas supper. I've been told you do good work." Eliza looked at the fabric, then at Frances. "Vera Halcott does better work than I do," she said. "I know, I'm not asking Vera." Frances held her gaze. "I'm asking you." It was the longest apology Frances Mercer was ever going to make. Eliza understood that. It came in the form of a bolt of good wool and a commission that required trust, and it meant something specific, that Frances had decided Eliza was worth trusting, which was Frances's version of saying she'd been wrong. "I'll need your measurements," Eliza said, obviously. "And a week at least. 10 days would be better. The supper's on the 19th. 10 days then." She took the fabric. "Come in." Frances came in. She sat at the kitchen table while Eliza found the measuring tape, and Owen appeared from somewhere, took one look at Frances, said, "Good afternoon, ma'am," and disappeared again with the tact of a child who had learned to read rooms. Frances watched him go. "He's grown," she said. "They do." "He seems settled." "He is." Frances watched Eliza write down measurements. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, in a different tone than she'd used before, lower, less structured, "I was unkind to you when you first came. I want to say that plainly." Eliza kept writing. "You said something like it before." "I said something in the direction of it. I'm saying it plainly now." A pause. "You weren't what I expected, and I treated the difference like a problem instead of a correction." Eliza put the measuring tape down and looked at her. Frances was not comfortable saying this. Her jaw was doing something tight and effortful, the way jaws did when the words coming out were costing more than usual. "Thank you," Eliza said. "That means something." Frances nodded, picked up her gloves from the table. "The dress, the collar, I'd like it higher than the current fashion. I have a neck that doesn't benefit from exposure." "I'll draft it that way." She left. Eliza stood in the kitchen with the green wool in her hands and thought about how long it took some people to arrive at the obvious, and how it was still worth something when they got there, even late, even imperfectly. The dress was done in 9 days. It fit well. Frances wore it to the alderman's supper and told 2 women there that Eliza Rowan had made it, which in a town the size of Forsyth Creek was equivalent to an advertisement that reached everyone who mattered in a social context. By January, Eliza had 3 private commissions from women she had never spoken to before. She did the work on evenings and Sundays at the kitchen table, while the stove held its warmth and Owen read his book in the chair by the window and Silas worked in the office down the hall. It was a quiet domestic arrangement that had arrived without ceremony and now simply existed, and she had stopped analyzing it and started just living inside it, which was its own kind of decision. The proposal happened in February. She said proposal, in her own recollection of it later, somewhat loosely, because it was not the kind of event that would have appeared theatrical to an outside observer. There was no particular staging. It was a Thursday evening after supper, Owen asleep, the house quiet, Eliza at the kitchen table finishing a seam on a commission piece, Silas coming in for a last cup of coffee before bed and then not leaving. He sat down across from her instead. She looked up. He looked at the table for a moment, the way he looked at things when he was working out how to say something. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to ask you something for about 2 months, and I haven't found a version of it that doesn't sound like I'm making a business arrangement." She set the sewing down. "Try anyway." He looked at her. "Will you marry me?" 4 words. No staging. No performance. She looked at him across the kitchen table, this man who fixed things without being asked, and went to bank managers without being thanked, and had put a blue enamel cup in a child's bag without making anything of it, who had never once made her feel that staying was an obligation or leaving was a betrayal, who said what he meant and meant what he said and had been, quietly and without announcement, one of the most decent people she had encountered in 31 years of encountering people. "I need to tell you something first," she said. He waited. "I am not easy to live with," she said. "I have strong opinions about how kitchens should be organized, and I am almost always right about them, and I will not pretend otherwise to make someone comfortable. I keep things to myself longer than I should, and when I'm worried I work faster, rather than saying I'm worried, which means I'll be making biscuits at odd hours sometimes, and it won't be obvious why." She looked at her hands. "I love Thomas, but I was not always happy in that marriage. And it took me a long time to understand that loving someone and being genuinely partnered with them are 2 different things, and I need the second thing, not just the first." Silas listened to all of this without moving. "Owen comes with everything," she said. "That's not a condition. It's just the shape of my life." "I know the shape of your life," Silas said. "I've been watching it for 7 months." She looked at him. "I have strong opinions about the kitchen." "You've mentioned." "I mean it." "Eliza," his voice was very steady. "I fixed a chair leg without being asked because I noticed it wobbled and it seemed like the obvious thing to do. That's how I operate. I think we can probably manage the kitchen." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." He didn't do anything theatrical with the word. He just sat with it for a moment, the way he sat with things, letting it settle. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and solid and unhurried. She turned her hand over. Owen found out the next morning at breakfast, because Eliza told him plainly before anything else. She sat across from him while the coffee went hot on the stove and said that she and Mr. Mercer were going to get married, and asked what he thought about that. Owen ate a bite of biscuit. He thought for a moment with the serious interior quality he had when he was actually considering something rather than formulating a polite response. Then he said, "Does this mean the bay mare is ours?" Silas, who had been standing near the stove, made a sound that was definitively a laugh, genuine and short and slightly surprised, which Eliza had never heard from him before. It transformed his face in a way she filed away as something she wanted to see again. "We can discuss the mare," Silas said. Owen nodded, satisfied, and finished his biscuit. They were married in March, in the town clerk's office, with Holt and Vera Halcott as witnesses, and Owen standing between them in his good jacket, which was getting tight across the shoulders because he had grown again. It was brief and practical and without ceremony, because neither of them wanted ceremony. They wanted the fact of the thing, not the performance of it. Afterward, they walked back to the ranch, all 4 of them, Holt and Vera having been invited for the noon meal. And Eliza made the best meal she'd made since arriving in Forsyth Creek, not because she was trying to mark the occasion, but because she had good ingredients and enough time, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, genuinely happy while she cooked. The happiness was not uncomplicated. Nothing real ever was. She was still a widow who had buried a man she had loved with his failures intact. She still had a son who carried old losses in the careful way children carried things that had been too heavy for too long. Silas still had the specific silences of a man who had been alone for 8 years and would have to learn, slowly, how to fill them with another person without losing himself in the adjustment. Francis was still Francis. The town was still the town. But the kitchen door hung straight. The chair at the table was steady. The blue enamel cup sat on the shelf where the morning light hit it right, which was where Owen had placed it on the first day back and where it had stayed. These were small things. Eliza had learned over the course of this particular year that small things were the actual architecture of a life. Not the grand moments, not the dramatic pivots, not the days when something broke wide open and rearranged everything visible. Those happened. They mattered. But what held a life together? What made it livable? What made it worth getting up at 4:30 for? What made a person feel, at the end of a hard day, that the day had been worth the being in, was the accumulation of small, honest things done by people who meant them. A door fixed. A chair steadied. Coffee made without being asked. A hand turned over on a kitchen table. These were the things. She knew this, and went on knowing it, through the rest of that winter and into the spring, and through the years that followed, which were not always easy and were not always kind, and were, in the way of real years, full of ordinary troubles and ordinary graces in approximately equal measure. And sometimes, on the evenings when the work was done, and Owen was in bed and Silas was in the office and the kitchen had gone quiet, she stood at the window above the sink, the same window she had stood at in the early weeks, watching Silas take her son to the barn. And she looked out at the yard in the dark, and she thought about the woman who had stood on a boarding house porch with a carpet bag and a 7-year-old and nothing else, listening to a door slam, watching a stagecoach disappear east. That woman had been her. She had not been broken by it, but she had been, for a time, reduced to it, to the bare fact of her own endurance, to the one foot in front of the other of it, to the getting through rather than the living. She was not merely getting through anymore. She was living. Specifically, genuinely, with all the mess and weight and occasional splendor that the word actually implied. She turned from the window. She put the last cup away. She turned the lamp down low. She walked down the hall of the house that was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not conditional, and went to bed. The kitchen door behind her stood open. It had stood open every morning since she came back, because that was the kind of house this had become, the kind where the door stayed open, where people came and went without having to announce themselves, where the fire was usually going and the coffee was usually on and the chair at the table was steady enough to trust. It was not a perfect house. It was a real one. That had always been the better thing to be.